Somewhere around the year 540, a British monk sat down and wrote the angriest book of the early Middle Ages. It is a sermon disguised as a history. He denounces his own people's kings by name. He calls them tyrants, and worse. And in the middle of it, he describes the one great victory, a siege at a hill, the Saxon advance broken, the island holding. He names the battle. He names the Roman-blooded commander who turned the tide. He even gives a date in his own maddening way. He does not name Arthur, not once, not anywhere. In the entire book, the name simply does not occur. 2 centuries later, Bede writes the great history of the English Church. He reads that monk closely. He repeats the victory. Bede does not name Arthur either. In fact, in every manuscript surviving from the year 400 to the year 820, in any language, the name is absent. 400 years of silence. And then the most famous king who never certainly lived walks onto the page, already carrying a legend. His name is Arthur. And here is the thing that took me a long time to understand about him. Arthur is not a story that was remembered. He is a story that was built in layers by men who mostly knew what they were adding. And those layers can be dated, not vaguely, in most cases almost to the decade. The sword in the stone, the round table, Camelot, Lancelot, the Grail. Each one has a first appearance, a date, and usually an author. Several are 800 years younger than the man they belong to, and they are the parts you know best. So we are going to dig, bottom layer first, and we will see exactly when each famous thing was added, and by whom. Start with the monk. His name is Gildas, and his book is On the Ruin of Britain, written most likely in the 530s or 40s. He is the only substantial British voice we have from anywhere near the century in question, not a historian, a furious clergyman writing to shame the living, and that matters. A man attacking the kings of his own day has no reason to invent a hero, and no reason to hide one. Gildas describes the Saxons arriving, the country burning, and then a recovery. And he credits that recovery to a man he calls Ambrosius Aurelianus. A Roman, he says, the last of that stock, a modest man whose parents had worn the purple and been killed in the storm. Under Ambrosius, the Britons take the field again. Fortunes swing back and forth, and then comes the siege of Badon Hill, and the Saxons are stopped. That is the victory. That is the battle Arthur is famous for, and the man standing in Arthur's place is named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas also drops a sentence about a 44th year and the year of his own birth, which scholars have argued over for centuries. The grammar is genuinely ambiguous. It may be dating the battle. It may be dating the book. Nobody has ever settled it. But the ambiguity is not the point. The point is what is missing from the most detailed account written closest to the events. The defining battle of Arthur's life, described by the nearest witness we have, with Arthur nowhere in the room. 200 years pass. In 731, Bede finishes his history of the English Church, and he leans on Gildas heavily. Bede repeats Ambrosius Aurelianus. Bede repeats Badon. And Bede is a meticulous man who names people constantly. He does not name Arthur because, as far as we can tell, there was nothing in front of him to name. So hold that shape. Our 2 best sources for the period both describe Arthur's war, and neither has heard of Arthur. Everything after this arrives late. The name surfaces for the first time we can actually date around the year 830 in a Welsh compilation called The History of the Britons. It is traditionally attributed to a monk named Nennius, though that attribution is itself disputed. The book is a scrapbook, genealogies, legends, annals, marvels. And in its 56th chapter, Arthur finally appears. Read the sentence slowly because it says something almost nobody notices. Then Arthur fought against them in those days, together with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was the leader of battles. Dux bellorum, leader of battles, not king. He fights alongside the kings. He is the commander they follow, and he is not one of them. The most famous king in European history does not begin as a king at all. He begins as a professional soldier working for kings. Then comes the list, 12 battles, and it reads like verse because it almost certainly was verse before somebody turned it into prose. The mouth of the river Glen. Then 4 separate battles on another river, the Douglas in a district called Linuis, the river Bassus, the wood of Celadon, the fort of Ginion, the city of the Legion, the river Tribruit, the mountain called Ognid, or in other copies, Bregwine, and the 12th, Mount Badon. Almost none of these places can be located today with any confidence. It is a rhythm, not a map. And at Ginion something strange happens. The text says Arthur carried the image of Holy Mary, ever virgin, upon his shoulders, into a battle. It is an odd picture, and there is a widely proposed explanation for it. In Welsh, the word for shield and the word for shoulder are near identical. The suggestion is that a lost Welsh source said shield, and whoever put it into Latin chose wrong. Be careful with that, though. It is a scholarly emendation, not a variant reading. No manuscript actually says shield. The texts all say shoulders. And then Badon, where the text stops being an annal and becomes a boast. 960 men fell in a single day from one charge by Arthur, and no one struck them down but Arthur alone. 960 men. One man, one charge. That is not a battle report, that is already myth. So the very first datable Arthur, 3 centuries after he supposedly lived, is superhuman on arrival. There was never a plain historical Arthur whom later writers slowly exaggerated. The earliest one we can reach is already impossible. And the same book carries an appendix that settles what kind of figure he was. A list of the wonders of Britain. 2 of them belong to Arthur. In the first, there is a heap of stones in a region called Buelt, and the stone on top bears a paw print. When Cabal, the dog of Arthur the soldier, was hunting the boar Troint, he pressed his print into that stone. Arthur built the cairn beneath it. And if you carry that stone away, the text says, it returns to the heap within a day and a night. That is not history. That is a landscape story, the kind country people tell about a rock they walk past every week. The second wonder is darker. Beside a spring there is a tomb, and the man buried in it was called Amr. He was the son of Arthur the soldier. And Arthur himself killed him and buried him in that place. And the tomb, the text adds, is never the same length twice, sometimes 6 feet, sometimes 9, sometimes 12, sometimes 15. And then the author adds 5 words that tell you everything about the quality of this source. And I myself have tested it. The man who hands us the 12 battles of Arthur also went to a field in Herefordshire and measured a grave repeatedly to see whether it moved. Sit with that. In the earliest surviving Arthurian material, Arthur has a dog with a famous paw and a son he murdered. No round table, no Grail, no Camelot, a magic stone and a dead child. The other early source is a set of Welsh annals surviving in a manuscript written around 1100, though the entries claim to be older. 2 of them mention Arthur. The first, placed around the year 516, is Badon again. And here the text says, Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors. On his shoulders again, 3 days and 3 nights. Either the same shield and shoulder confusion, or the same borrowed phrase. Scholars differ. The second entry, about 20 years later, is a single short line, and it is the seed of the entire tragedy. The strife of Camelot, in which Arthur and Madrout fell, and there was death in Britain and in Ireland. Read it again, because nearly everybody misreads it. It says both men fell. It does not say they fought each other. It does not call Madrout a traitor. It does not make him Arthur's nephew, or his son, or his enemy at all. For all this line tells us, they could have died side by side. Mordred the villain does not exist yet. He is a name in an obituary. And here is the extraordinary part. We can actually watch him being invented, because later copies of these same annals quietly rewrite the entry. In the 13th century versions it reads, "The Battle of Camelot, in which the renowned Arthur, king of the Britons, and Modred, his traitor, fell by mutual wounds." Look at what has been added. Arthur has been promoted to king, Madrout has been handed the word traitor, and now they kill each other. None of that is in the older manuscript. And the rewrite happens after Geoffrey of Monmouth. The historical record was edited to agree with the story. And one more caution, which honest accounts include and popular ones skip. These annals may have been compiled as late as the 10th century, which would place even this thin evidence 4 centuries after the fact, and well after the legend had begun to grow. There is one more candidate for an early trace, and it is the most tantalizing and the least secure of all. A Welsh war poem called Why Gadadon Mourns a Doomed War Band. Of one warrior it says that he fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, and then it adds 5 words that have launched 1,000 arguments. Though he was not Arthur. If that line is original, it is our earliest reference, and it tells us something remarkable. By then, Arthur was already the standard. Not a man you compare to others, the measure that others fall short of, a benchmark, which means already a legend. But the manuscript is 13th century. The poem passed through generations of oral transmission, and that half line is exactly what a later reciter adds. It survives in only one of the 2 hands that copied the poem, with no parallel version to check it against. And there is a further twist. The Victorian scholar who first printed the passage read it without the negative, as straightforward praise. He was an Arthur. The famous he was. No, Arthur is the modern reading of a difficult line. Nobody can prove the dating either way, and the honest scholars say so. Now leave the chronicles entirely, because there is a second Arthur running in parallel, and he is far stranger than the one in the annals. In the Welsh tales he is not defending Christendom. He is hunting monsters, raiding the otherworld, and presiding over a war band of impossible men. The great example is a tale called Coljepich and Olwen. A young man is cursed by his stepmother to love a woman he has never met. Her name is Olwen. Her father is a giant called Badon, and the giant is fated to die on the day his daughter marries. So the giant sets conditions, roughly 40 of them, everyone impossible. And here is the detail that gives the whole thing away. The tale lists about 40 impossible tasks and then narrates only a handful. The rest are announced and simply dropped, which means the audience already knew those stories. We are reading the summary of a tradition far larger than the text that survived. Coljepich goes for help to his cousin. His cousin is Arthur. And look hard at the court he walks into. It is not Camelot. Camelot will not be invented for another 500 years. Arthur's court here is Selwig in Cornwall. And these men are not knights. The tale reels off Arthur's followers, over 200 warriors, and more than 250 names in all. Men who can drink a sea dry. Men who can hear an ant stir 50 miles away. A tracker who can follow a scent across open water. Folklorists file this tale under a standard international folktale type, the hero who gathers helpers with absurd gifts to win an impossible bride. That is the genre, not chronicle, not romance, folktale. And Arthur owns things, and the things have names. His sword is Caledvorche, his spear, Rongominiad, his shield, Winagrathucha, his dagger, Carnwenan, his ship, Prydwen, and his wife, Gwenwyfar. Every one of those survives into English, battered by translation. Caledvorche becomes Excalibur. Gwenwyfar becomes Guinevere. And two of his warriors here, C and Bedwyr, become Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere. They are the oldest companions Arthur has. Not Lancelot, not Galahad, two Welsh names attached to a boar hunt. And the boar hunt is the heart of the tale. Church Traith is a king transformed into a monstrous swine, running from Ireland across Wales into Cornwall. Between its ears it carries a comb, a shears, and a razor, and the giant demands them to groom his beard for the wedding. So Arthur raises a host. A country is crossed, men die, all to take grooming tools off a pig. That is the oldest narrative Arthur we possess, not the defender of Britain, a warlord chasing a boar so that a boy can marry. There is a second Welsh text, and it is stranger still, a poem called Praedu Annwn, the spoils of the otherworld. Arthur sails his ship down into the underworld to steal a cauldron. The cauldron is warmed by the breath of 9 maidens, and it will not boil the food of a coward, a vessel that judges the men who come near it. Hold that thought for later. The poem counts. 3 shiploads of men went in with Arthur, and then 6 times over a line comes back like a bell tolling. Except 7, none returned. Except 7, none returned. 6 fortresses, the same refrain, the same appalling arithmetic. You will be told this poem is the first Grail story. Be careful with that. A magic vessel, guarded in an otherworld fortress, won by a raiding hero. That family of images is real, and the resemblance is genuine. But the serious position is that these are cousins, not ancestors. Some scholars deny even that much connection. The straight line gets drawn far too hard. And now the honesty that popular accounts skip. It is usually said that the Welsh Arthur is the early Arthur, the original, lying underneath the romance. The manuscripts are late, 14th century, 15th century, and the linguistic dating of the tales themselves is genuinely contested. One reassessment places Colhoch in the second half of the 12th century, which would make it later than the book it is supposed to predate. So the careful claim is not that this Arthur is older. It is that this Arthur is independent, a separate tradition drawing on different water. What is firmly earlier is the battle list, the annals, and one more body of evidence, the lives of the Welsh saints. Welsh hagiographers had a practical problem. To display a saint's holiness, you need somebody powerful for him to overcome. Arthur was available. So in these lives, written in the 11th and early 12th centuries, Arthur is a useful antagonist, greedy, hot-tempered, and always outmatched by a monk. In the life of St. Cadoc, Arthur demands a herd of cattle as compensation for 3 dead soldiers. He is duly given them, and the moment he takes possession, the cattle turn into bundles of ferns in his hands. But the important one is a life of Gildas, written around 1120, and it contains a story that ought to be famous. A king named Melwas, ruling the summer country, abducts Guinevere. Arthur searches for his wife for an entire year before he learns where she is. She is at Glastonbury, and Glastonbury is defended by reed and river and marsh. Arthur brings the armies of Cornwall and Devon and lays siege. And then the abbot and Gildas walk out between the 2 battle lines and talk them down. Guinevere is handed back. Nobody fights at all. Hold on to that, because it matters enormously in an hour. 50 years before any French poet writes a word, the abduction of Guinevere already exists. What is missing from it is the rescuer. There is no Lancelot. Arthur besieges the place himself, and 2 clergymen end it with a conversation. And notice what this writer calls Arthur, not the flower of kings. He calls him a tyrant. He calls him the rebellious king. There is one last piece of pre-Romance evidence, and it is not written at all. It is carved. On the cathedral in Modena, in northern Italy, an archway carries a relief of armed knights attacking a castle with 2 towers, and the figures are labeled Artus of Britain, Chi, who is Kay, Galvagan, who is Gawain, and inside the castle a woman named Winlogi. Winlogi is generally read as Guinevere. The scene is a rescue from an abduction, the same story as the life of Gildas. The dating is argued over, but the usual range is 1120 to 1140, level with the first written Arthurian books, or slightly before them. Arthurian legend was already traveling far enough to be carved into an Italian cathedral in a version nobody had yet thought to publish. Everything so far is scattered. A battle list, a boar, a poem, a saint's anecdote, a carving. There is no life of Arthur anywhere. And then, around 1136, one man sits down and writes one. His name is Geoffrey of Monmouth, and the book is The History of the Kings of Britain, and you have to understand what he actually did. He did not write a chronicle. He wrote a national epic, filed it as history, and Europe believed him for 400 years. He knew a claim like that needed cover, so he opens with an alibi, and it is a beautiful one. Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, he says, gave him a very ancient book in the British tongue, telling the whole story from Brutus down to Cadwallader. Geoffrey is merely translating. That book has never been found, never been quoted by anyone else, and essentially no scholar today believes it existed. Now watch how much of your mental picture of Arthur walks in through that door for the very first time. Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, that is Geoffrey. The conception at Tintagel, that is Geoffrey. Uther sees Agurna, the wife of Duke Gorlois, at a feast, and the text says he fell passionately in love with her. She is not available to him. So Merlin offers a solution. I know how, he says, by the force of my medicines, to give you the exact likeness of Gorlois. And Uther walks into Tintagel wearing another man's face, and the text says that the same night she conceived the most renowned Arthur. The real husband is killed that same night in a skirmish elsewhere, before the deception is even discovered. Geoffrey does not pause over any of it. Britain's greatest king is conceived by deception, in a scene the author reports without a flicker of moral difficulty. Merlin himself is Geoffrey's construction, and we can watch him build it out of 2 unrelated men. In the 9th century material, there is a fatherless prophetic boy who confronts a tyrant over a collapsing tower. That text calls him Ambrosius. And separately, in Welsh tradition, there is a mad prophet in the northern woods named Merlin, with no connection to Arthur whatsoever. Geoffrey welds them into a single man and calls him Merlinus Ambrosius, one character made from two, neither of whom belonged to Arthur. There is a well-known suggestion by the medievalist Gaston Paris about why the name shifted shape from Merlin to Merlin, that a Latinized form would have sounded, to French ears, uncomfortably like an obscenity. It is a suggestion, not a proven finding, but it is a plausible one. Then Geoffrey arms him, and a legend is born inside a single clause. He girds on Excalibur, the text says, an excellent sword made in the Isle of Avalon. His lance is called Ron, his shield is Prewin. Excalibur is Geoffrey's Latin for the Welsh Caledvoch. The French will turn it into Excalibur. English will settle on Excalibur. So Excalibur is genuinely old, and it genuinely comes from Avalon. But look hard at what is not in that sentence. There is no stone, there is no lake, there is no arm rising from the water. Arthur is crowned by a bishop, like any other king. Geoffrey gives him a wife, Guinevere, of a noble Roman family, and a nephew, Modred, the son of Arthur's sister and King Lot. Nephew, not son. The incest everybody knows. Arthur fathering the man who destroys him is not here. That arrives roughly a century later. And Geoffrey's Guinevere is not a victim. When Modred seizes the crown, the text says she, in violation of her first marriage, wickedly married him. No coercion, no excuse offered. Geoffrey assigns her the blame, sends her to a convent to live chastely among nuns, and never mentions her again. The torn, sympathetic, tragic Guinevere is not the original. The original is a usurper's willing consort, disposed of in a sentence. Then Camelot. Modred falls. Arthur is mortally wounded, and Geoffrey writes the most consequential ambiguity in British literature. Arthur is carried to the Isle of Avalon, the text says, to be cured of his wounds. He hands the crown to his kinsman Constantine, and Geoffrey never says that he died. That silence is the whole once and future king. It is not a prophecy. It is a sentence that declines to finish itself. Now, here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Take Geoffrey's Arthurian chapters and search them for the furniture of the legend. Camelot is not there. The Round Table is not there. Lancelot is not there. The Grail is not there. Galahad is not there. The Lady of the Lake is not there. The Sword in the Stone is not there. There is no order of knights of any kind. Arthur's companions are Cador, Hoel, Bedver, his butler, and Caius, his steward. His court is Caerleon, on the river Usk. The single most complete early account of Arthur's life contains almost nothing of what you came here for. And yet this is the book that made him. It survives in around 200 manuscripts, a staggering number for the 12th century. Not everyone was fooled. Writing near the end of that same century, the historian William of Newburgh was blunt about it. Only a person ignorant of ancient history, he wrote, would have any doubt about how shamelessly and impudently he lies in almost everything. He was right, and it made no difference whatsoever. Geoffrey had handed Europe a story, and Europe wanted the story. Within 20 years it was being translated, and the translators immediately started adding. In 1155, an Anglo-Norman poet named Wace turned Geoffrey's Latin into French verse, and he inserted one object that outlived everything else he wrote. Arthur's followers, Wace explains, all reckoned themselves the greatest, and none would accept a seat lower than another's. So Arthur had a table made round. Wace's own words are that their chairs should be high alike, their service equal, and none before or after his comrade. That is it. That is the origin of the Round Table. 1155, in a French poem, as a solution to an argument about seating. It is not Celtic. It is not ancient. It is courtly problem-solving, invented 6 centuries after Arthur is supposed to have lived. And it is arguably the most recognizable image in the entire legend. Then comes the man who changes everything. And he is a poet, not a chronicler. Chrétien de Troyes wrote in Champagne in the second half of the 12th century, for aristocratic patrons with very particular tastes. And he did something Geoffrey never attempted. He took Arthur's court and made it a setting, a place from which knights ride out into their own stories. Arthur stops being the protagonist. He becomes the still point at the center, the king in the hall, while other men have the adventures. That single shift is why the legend never ended. An epic about one king finishes when the king dies. A court is a machine for generating stories forever. And in a romance written around 1177, at the request of his patron Marie de Champagne, Chrétien introduces a knight. Guinevere has been abducted by a man named Meleagant, and you have met that abduction already in the life of Gildas 50 years earlier. But this time there is a rescuer, and to follow her he must accept a humiliation, riding in a cart, the vehicle used to haul condemned criminals. He hesitates for 2 steps before he climbs in. 2 steps. And the entire romance turns on that hesitation, because love should not have hesitated at all. The knight's name is Lancelot. This is the first time in surviving literature he is a protagonist, and the first time he loves Arthur's queen. The most famous love affair in Western legend is not ancient. It is a commission written to a patron's specification in the 1170s. Chrétien did not even finish it. Another writer completed the poem for him. And there is a detail in that same romance worth stopping for. In one line, Arthur is said to be holding court at a place called Camelot. One line. That is the first appearance of the most famous place name in the legend, and it does not appear in all the manuscripts. In one important copy the name is simply not there. Where the others write Camelot, that scribe writes an ordinary French phrase meaning as he pleased. And here is the part that should stop you. Some editors think that blank is what Chrétien actually wrote, and that Camelot is the addition. Camelot enters history as a single word in a single line, which some copyists did not think worth keeping. In Geoffrey and elsewhere in Chrétien, Arthur's court is Caerleon, a real Roman town in Wales with real walls you can still walk around today. The imaginary capital beat the real one completely. And then, near the end of his life, Chrétien began a romance he never finished, and it broke the legend wide open. A naive young man raised in the forest arrives at a mysterious castle. That evening he watches a procession cross the hall. A squire carries a white lance, and blood runs from its tip. Then a maiden carries in a vessel blazing with light. The text calls it a Grail. And this is where the great misunderstanding begins, because in 12th century French, a Grail is not a holy object. It is a serving dish, a wide, fairly deep platter, the kind used to bring fish to a table. And the poem tells you what is in it. A single communion wafer which sustains the castle's ancient lord who has eaten nothing else for years. Chrétien does call it a holy thing once, but he never uses it as a title. It is a holy dish, not the Holy Grail. That capital letter is somebody else's, and it passes through the hall at every course of an ordinary venison dinner, uncovered, beside a silver carving platter. It is functioning as servingware. Carry past a boy who fails to ask the one question that would heal a wounded king. And the reason he cannot speak is a sin he committed before he ever arrived. And then Chrétien died before explaining any of it. He left the most powerful loose end in European literature, and everybody else rushed in to tie it. The man who tied it was Robert de Boron, writing around the year 1200, and his solution was to make the dish Christian. In his telling, the vessel is the one used at the Last Supper, and afterwards the one that caught Christ's blood at the cross. Joseph of Arimathea carries it to Britain. In a single move, a French serving platter becomes the holiest object in Christendom. The Holy Grail is younger than the Grail, and the Grail is younger than Geoffrey. All of it is centuries younger than Arthur. And Robert contributed something else, which you have known since you were a child. In his account of Merlin, a sword stands fixed in a stone. Whoever draws it out is the rightful king. A boy pulls it free, and the kingdom is forced to accept him. Around the year 1200, that is when the sword in the stone enters the world, one of the last pieces added, and the first one children learn. The next stage is not a poem, but an industry. In the early 13th century, French writers assembled an enormous cycle in prose. 5 branches covering everything. The Grail's origins, Merlin, Lancelot's life, the great quest, and the fall of the kingdom. And the men writing it had a religious agenda. The quest becomes an examination in which worldly knighthood is weighed and found wanting. Lancelot, the finest knight alive, is disqualified from the Grail because of the affair. His sin is now the point of the story. So a new knight is invented to succeed where Lancelot fails, perfect, virginal, and Lancelot's own son. His name is Galahad. Galahad, the purest figure in Arthurian legend, is a 13th century fix for a plot problem. He is roughly 85 years younger than Geoffrey. This cycle also gives Lancelot a childhood. He is raised beneath a lake by an enchantress, and that is where the Lady of the Lake becomes a character. And it makes the fatal change to Mordred. He is no longer the nephew. He is Arthur's son by Arthur's own half-sister, conceived in ignorance. Arthur now fathers his own destruction. It is a magnificent piece of tragic engineering, and it is 7 centuries younger than its subject. A revised version of the cycle went further still, and it is where the 2 swords finally collide. In it, the sword drawn from the stone is never named. Arthur breaks it in a fight. Only afterwards does a hand rise from a lake and offer him another. 2 swords, 2 separate stories. The stone one proves he is king. The lake one is Excalibur. Almost nobody knows that today because of what happened next. In the 15th century, an English knight sat in prison and wrote the version that won. His name was Thomas Malory. He finished it, by his own reckoning, in the 9th year of the reign of King Edward IV, around 1470. The identification is not certain, but the leading candidate had been accused of ambush, extortion, robbing an abbey, attempted murder, and rape. In the manuscript he calls himself a knight prisoner. The greatest English account of chivalry was written in a cell, quite possibly for good reason. And hold that phrase, because something happens to it. Keep it in mind for about 450 years. What Malory did was not invention, it was compression. He took the vast French cycles and rendered them in English prose that actually moves. and he made choices that became permanent. He did not invent the two swords. He blurred them. He gave both of them the name Excalibur. And that was enough. Every retelling since has inherited the blur. The stone, the lake, one blade, one story. Malory's slip or Malory's improvement. And now it is simply the truth. William Caxton printed it in 1485 on England's new printing press, divided it into 21 books, and gave it the title we still use. And then something remarkable happened in 1934. A manuscript was found at Winchester College, far closer to what Malory actually wrote. It shows that Caxton reorganized him heavily. What Caxton presented as one continuous book reads, in the manuscript, as a set of separate tales, and it restored something Caxton had cut. That phrase, night prisoner, appears nowhere in the printed book. Caxton removed it. For 449 years, the most famous book of English chivalry gave no hint that its author wrote it locked up. The prison came back in 1934. The unified Morte d'Arthur is partly a printer's construction. Even the shape of the definitive version was edited into being. And at the very end, Malory does something careful. He records that some men say Arthur never died, and that he will come again. And then he refuses it. I will not say it shall be so, he writes, but rather I will say, here in this world he changed his life. And only then, at 2 removes, does he give the famous words. Many men say, he writes, that there is written upon his tomb this verse. Here lies Arthur, the king that was, and the king that shall be. Malory never claims to have seen it. He is reporting what people say is written somewhere. So let us lay the whole thing out, because once the dates sit side by side, the shape is undeniable. Arthur the war leader, 9th century, 300 years after the fact, and already killing 900 men single-handed. Arthur the monster hunter, with Bedwyr and Guinevere, the Welsh tradition, independent and impossible to date securely before the 12th century. Uther, Tintagel, Merlin, Excalibur's name, Avalon, Mordred, the traitor and Guinevere's betrayal, Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1136. The Round Table, Wace, 1155. Lancelot the Affair, and Camelot, Chrétien de Troyes, the 1170s, written on commission. The Grail as a dish, Chrétien again, around 1180. The Holy Grail is Christ's own vessel, Robert de Boron, around 1200. The Sword in the Stone, Robert de Boron, around 1200. The Lady of the Lake, Galahad, and Mordred, as Arthur's incestuous son, the French prose cycle, the 1210s and 20s. One sword instead of 2, Malory, around 1470. The oldest layer is a list of battles. Everything else is medieval literature, and most of it has an author and a decade, which leaves the question everybody actually came for. Was there a real man at the bottom of all this? And it is worth knowing that the question is not modern. Caxton is already fielding it in his preface in 1485. Divers men hold opinion, he writes, that there was no such Arthur, and that all such books made of him be feigned and fables, because some chronicles make of him no mention. His answer is a list of tourist attractions: Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury, a seal at Westminster, Gawaine's skull at Dover, the Round Table hanging at Winchester, and then he gives up and hands it to the reader. To give faith and belief that all is true that is contained herein, he says, ye be at your liberty. The man who printed the definitive Arthur declined to vouch for him, so the honest answer requires holding 2 things at once, which is harder than picking a side. Here is the case against. No source written during the period names him. Nothing at all survives from 400 to 820. Gildas, closest to the events, describes the war and credits Ambrosius Aurelianus. Bede, reading Gildas, does exactly the same. The first datable mention is 3 centuries late, in a compilation that also reports a stone which walks home and a tomb that changes length. The historian David Dumville put the skeptical case about as sharply as it can be put. Arthur, he argued, owes his place in our history books to a no smoke without fire school of thought. There is no historical evidence about him at all. There is, he wrote, no historical evidence about Arthur. We must reject him from our histories, and above all from the titles of our books. And a historian answering him 40 years later put it more memorably still. Arthur has produced extraordinary quantities of smoke, he said, because he is so well suited to be a fulcrum of make-believe. But there is no fire underlying the stories, just Highland mist. Other scholars go further and argue the traffic runs the other way, that Arthur begins in folklore and legend and is only later dressed as history, which would neatly explain why the earliest Arthur we can reach hunts a magic boar and owns a dog with a famous paw. But there is one argument on the other side that deserves a proper hearing, because it is genuinely the best one there is. In the late 6th and early 7th centuries, suddenly several men appear bearing the name. A prince of the Scots of Dal Riata, a Briton who kills an Irish king with a thrown stone. A king's son in Dyfed, 2 generations below a tyrant Gildas rebukes by name. 4 men called Arthur, clustered within about 60 years. And the argument runs like this. People name their sons after somebody. A cluster like that implies a famous predecessor, remembered recently enough to honor. It is a real pattern, and it demands an answer. But there are 2 problems with it, and the second is fatal. The first is that all 4 sit in Irish or Gaelic-speaking contexts, while every early source insists Arthur was a Briton. The Britons themselves avoided the name entirely. In fact, no Welshman of British descent is recorded bearing it for something like 1,000 years. The people who supposedly remembered him would not use it. And the second problem is decisive. Around the year 1100, a second and much larger wave of Arthur names appears in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy. By that date, Arthur is unambiguously a legend. Nobody imagines those parents were commemorating a war leader their grandfathers had marched behind, which tells you what naming waves actually track. Fame, not historicity. The cluster is consistent with a real Arthur. It is not evidence for one. And then there is Glastonbury, which is the clearest proof we have that people manufacture Arthur whenever they need him. In 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey announced that they had dug up Arthur and Guinevere, 16 feet down, a hollowed oak trunk, 2 skeletons, and a lead cross, conveniently inscribed. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. Historians today generally dismiss it, and you only have to consider the timing. The abbey had burned down 7 years earlier and desperately needed money to rebuild. A shrine holding the actual bones of King Arthur solves that overnight. And it solves a political problem too. The Welsh believed Arthur would return to drive out their conquerors. A grave ends that hope permanently. There is a detail that gives the forgery away. Our sources record at least 5 different versions of what that cross actually said. One eyewitness account describes Guinevere as Arthur's second wife, a claim found nowhere else in the entire tradition. The relic's own text will not sit still. The bones were reburied with great ceremony, attended by a king, and they were lost completely when the abbey was dissolved in the 1530s. The most famous grave in Britain was almost certainly a fundraising exercise, and it is now empty in every sense of the word, and archaeology has closed the door on it. In the 1960s, an excavator identified a pit at the abbey as the site of the grave. A full reassessment of the abbey's excavations, published in 2015, took that apart. Beneath the pit lies a stone-lined grave dated to the 10th or 11th century, which means the pit above it must be later still. Whatever was dug there, a man from the 6th century cannot have been lying in it. You will also meet confident theories naming a specific real man, a Roman officer called Lucius Artorius Castus, who served in Britain centuries too early. And that one is worth a moment, because it collapses in a way that is genuinely instructive. The theory rests on an inscription. It is usually said the stone records Castus leading an expedition against the Armoricans, that is, against Brittany, the British connection. But that reading is a 19th century scholar's conjectural restoration. The stone itself is damaged, and the letters he supplied do not fit the space available. The earliest published reading of it, and the current scholarly one, is not Armoricans at all. It is Armenians, a different campaign at the other end of the empire. The entire bridge from this Roman officer to the Arthurian world rests on a restoration that the stone does not support. Or Riothamus, a British ruler who took an army into Gaul around the year 470, was defeated and disappears from the record. You will be told he vanished near a town called Avalon. Our source says no such thing. It says he fled toward the Burgundians. The Avalon detail is the theory's own inference. These are not absurd, but they are minority positions, and they share a weakness. Each explains one feature and needs everything else to be coincidence. And both share a deeper problem. Both begin by assuming Arthur was a real person who needs identifying, which is the very thing in question. Even the name resists a simple answer. The most widely accepted derivation is from the Roman family name Artorius. The popular explanation that it means bear man in Welsh is rejected on linguistic grounds. Those Welsh words would not produce this form, and the proof is unexpectedly elegant. In Welsh verse, the name always rhymes with words ending in and never with words ending in Bearman would have to end in r, including in that Gododin stanza, where Arthur rhymes with every line around it. So the oldest possible mention of the name is also the best single piece of evidence against the folk etymology built on top of it, which is its own small lesson. Even the syllables of his name carry a folk etymology, and the folk etymology is the version everybody repeats. So what does the evidence actually support? It supports this. Something happened in Britain in the late 5th century. The Saxon advance stalled for roughly a generation, and there was a victory at a place called Badon. Gildas confirms that much, and he is a hostile witness with no interest in flattering anybody. What the evidence does not support is a name attached to it. The man who won that war, if it was one man, is anonymous. Perhaps he was called Arthur, and no surviving writer happened to say so. Perhaps another leader's deeds were later handed to a legendary name. Both are possible. Neither is demonstrable. And one scholar's formulation remains the fairest summary anybody has managed. There may well have been a historical Arthur, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him. That is not a satisfying answer, and I am not going to dress it up as one. But consider what the alternative would actually cost us. If we found him tomorrow, a real chieftain, a real fort, a real grave, what would we have? A minor warlord in a collapsing province at the far edge of a dying empire, whose victory delayed a conquest by perhaps 40 years. What we have instead is a boy pulling a sword from a stone, a table with no head, a cup no sinner can approach, a queen who loved the wrong man. 9 centuries of writers, each adding a piece, not one of them able to leave it alone. And underneath all of it, a single sentence written by a Welsh cleric in 1136. It says only that the king was carried away to be healed of his wounds. And then it stops. And never says that he died,